Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Liberty Ventures podcast. My name is Alexander McCobin, founder and CEO of Liberty Ventures. And for those who are tuning in for the first time, or just as a reminder, what we're doing is building the ecosystem of values-aligned business leaders, investors, executives, and entrepreneurs who are committed to a free and prosperous future, and in particular, helping them scale their businesses to scale their impact. And my guest today is a longtime friend who I first met back in the day through Students for Liberty, and now I'm excited to have in the Liberty Ventures ecosystem. David Thayer has been involved in companies that you would recognize that he's going to tell us more about. He's an active investor at every level right now and is just an incredible individual. David, thanks for joining us and sharing your wisdom today. I would love to start by just giving you a chance to give everyone a deeper introduction to your background, what's made you who you are, and it explains what you're doing today.
Sure. Thanks, Alexander. Really appreciate it. I'm obliged to preface our conversation by mentioning that I'm semi-retired from Blackstone, but I'm still serving there as an executive advisor. And I'm obliged to mention that, of course, anything we discuss today is my opinion and not theirs. But I suspected that perhaps you'd ask this question, and in thinking about, my evolution as an individual, it's probably best to kind of quickly go through a chronology. So I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, went to the University of Pennsylvania, Wharton undergraduate, and then while there, joined the good old U.S. Army, a National Guard unit called the First City Troop, which is an old kind of storied unit, the oldest in the country, actually, at least the oldest cavalry unit. Still ride horses and do interesting things like that, in addition to kind of cruise around the tanks. So we're on that in a moment. But after graduating from Wharton, went into consulting, then went to graduate school at the London School of Economics, got a degree there in international history. And relating to our favorite topic, the freedom movement, while there, the Berlin Wall fell, so we zipped right over to Berlin, and I have some interesting pictures, certainly experiences of me sitting atop the Berlin Wall and hammering off chunks of it, which I still have downstairs in the house. So that was kind of fun, and really stayed with me, because I think that in part led to my interest in freedom, seeing that sort of dichotomy between freedom and tyranny, which was so apparent, at least when I was growing up, when the Cold War was still afoot. Got back, went into consulting, also spent some time in industry, did a couple of startups as well that were abject failures, but that's part of the learning process.
Part of the process, that's right.
Indeed. And then went to the University of Chicago for my MBA. Really love that. Really singular experience. Went back into consulting for Booz Allen and another firm called the Corporate Executive Board in Washington, D.C., and then got deployed. I was called up to active duty after having also skipped a chapter going to officer candidate school. So after a stint at Fort Benning and at Fort Knox, at various breaks during my career, was serving the Guard and got called up to Bosnia. So I was there for a year in the Balkans. And when I got back, was asked to join a hedge fund run by an acquaintance of mine, a good friend, actually. And, I'd never been in the hedge fund space, but he trusted me and my entrepreneurial experience, and I had some operations experience. And that really kind of got me into hedge funds, which gets us closer to where we are now. So I did that. That was a success, but left there to launch something called Harvest Fund Advisors, which invests in the midstream energy space. And by the way, at this point in my personal trajectory, I'm back in Philadelphia. So in the suburbs of Philadelphia, we launched Harvest, and that grew from $10 million under management with 3 inside capital investors to $12 billion under management with several hundred investors, most of which were institutional. And so that went on for like a dozen years, where I served as a partner, co-founder, and chief financial officer, chief compliance officer. And then Blackstone sniffed around and decided that we were an interesting outfit, and they wanted to play in that sandbox as well. So they bought the firm in 2017. We became a part of Harvest, and I was a partner there for 5.5 years. And then, as mentioned, kind of semi-retired. We're now serving as an executive advisor and still associated with the firm, but also doing other interesting things.
So that is a rich backstory for you, David. Having served in the military, having been involved in so many different incredible businesses there, and now still associated with Blackstone, as you said, but also doing your own thing as an investor. Would love to share with everyone that I know that you're not only involved with Liberty Ventures, but you're also actively investing in the public markets. You're also investing in other venture capital funds, and I'm curious just how you're approaching investing now as an individual. How do you think about that broadly in making your decisions for what you do?
Yeah. So, typically the way that it works now is that, I'm much more actively focused on investing. Of course, I learned a thing or two, even by osmosis, given what we did for 25 years. But, given some constraints I have at the firm, what I usually do is kind of scan the horizon for new opportunities and then pass them to our advisor so that he can evaluate them, just as background. But it's always been a source of interest to me. The markets, generally speaking, I admit to being a diehard capitalist. Some might even describe a couple of us, including me, as anarcho-capitalist. But nonetheless, I'm a pretty hardcore libertarian, and I'm not embarrassed by that fact. And I think free markets have liberated billions of people over the years, and I'm proud to be a participant in the free market. But to answer your question, I think first and foremost, it helps, as I just indicated, to have sort of an overarching worldview, one that's been tested empirically, one that you're continually testing yourself to ensure that it really holds water. And I find that even smart people in places like, for instance, the Federal Reserve either don't have a worldview, a praxis, or they have the wrong one. And I think their Keynesian worldview happens to be wrong. My worldview is Austrian, so of course I'm probably biased in that regard. But it's interesting, if you kind of approach the markets with that mental model, it will inform every decision you make. And that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation right now. But I think, too, it relates to something else, which is the willingness to be a contrarian, to think critically, because oftentimes you're going against the herd. This is not sort of mainstream economic thinking. It's not what I learned, even at the University of Chicago, which is known for its free market orientation, and certainly not at Wharton, but or the LSE for that matter. But I think it's the one that works. And so I think, especially as we've learned the last few years, we have to be willing to think critically for ourselves and not necessarily just listen to experts or talking heads. And that has really, I think, for me anyway, led to some successful investments. And I hope that you share that worldview, because I think it will lead to some successful investing for you as well.
So let's break that down for everyone here and start at a very basic level. You mentioned the Austrian worldview. So what does that mean for anyone who's not familiar with that term, especially from an investor's lens?
I think, okay, so there are probably several things to say, but one is that the markets should be left to their own devices. By markets, we're really saying it's individual actors. And individual actors are the ones, you and I and everyone else on this call, are the ones who are in the best position to make decisions for themselves and their families. And that, of course, applies to all realms of life, not just investing. But I think ultimately, economics is more about human action, as a famous book was entitled, than it is just about dollars and cents and finance, where those two terms tend to get conflated, finance and economics. Economics really encompasses the broader range of human behavior. And the reason I kind of set that table is that I think that informs one's investment perspective. And that, to me anyway, is, to answer your question, the essence of Austrian economics. That really is a different thing. So in an investing context, I think it's important to, for instance, understand the role that central banking has in our lives, and especially now because of what's called fiscal dominance, that can affect investments that would otherwise succeed or not succeed on their own merits. And so we have to be very cognizant of what the government, and or the central banks around the world are doing, because I think that has a real influence on the prospects of individual investments.
Let's say I agree with you on all of that, and I do actually. Let's say others who are listening agree with that too. You're talking about broad macro trends here, and there are,
Yeah,
and Austrian economics comes from incredible academics who weren't investors themselves. They didn't make a lot of money by
right.
applying their theory to individual cases. How do you actively make decisions about which companies to invest in or which funds to support based on that worldview?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of things. One is that I should mention as well that you know just to back up for a second, in addition to having a worldview, I believe this one to be the correct one, but in addition to having a worldview, it's also super important to be extremely well informed, to be constantly scanning the horizon, to have sort of a really keenly refined filter, which is best refined over time. Unfortunately, I think experience is the best teacher in that regard. Um, so it's not just scooping up information and boiling the ocean. It's also apply a very refined filter to understand where the opportunities are. So that, I think, goes along with what I was saying earlier. But drilling down on what you just asked, um, I'm biased by a macro worldview because that's just kind of the way I'm wired. And others may kind of take a more bottoms up view. And I fully respect that. And I think it can be very successful, obviously. But when I evaluate investment opportunities and have over the years, I personally find macro tends to be informative. So, for instance, I personally have found Bitcoin to be very lucrative investment terrain, and it's not just Bitcoin itself, which is sort of a vote against kind of so-called fiat money, but Bitcoin serves several different functions. Bitcoin itself, but then there are also Bitcoin adjacent firms that are like the picks and shovels of the space. And so Bitcoin has several use cases beyond just being an alternative like digital gold to fiat money, which I think in itself is a compelling investment opportunity. But it is a way to transfer funds overseas very cheaply and instantaneously with immediate settlement. It's censorship free. It's very useful, not just for transfer payments where somebody might have to pay 10, 20, 30%. Well, maybe not that much, but certainly 10 to 20% in terms of the fees they pay to Western Union to transfer money overseas, which for a poor person, say, working in this country, transferring money overseas is meaningful. That's 1 month's pay right there. But it's also, speaking of liberty, very useful when it comes to funneling funds to dissidents in tyrannical regimes who otherwise would have their funds monitored. You may be aware that the Human Rights Foundation has done some really good work in this regard, as has,
In particular, yeah.
by the way, Students for Liberty. And so I really respect that. And I think that may kind of bring us full circle to what you're doing, because one final thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up for a moment, is that there's kind of fertile field here that we can furrow because certain areas of the investment realm have been abandoned. And I think that relates to Bitcoin because people don't understand it, and it's still very early days. I think there's a lot of promise there, especially with an ETF likely coming next month, which will enable easier access to Bitcoin. But furthermore, because certain elements of our economy have been declared sort of off limits by the likes of BlackRock and other ESG-oriented investors, there's some really compelling investment opportunities for the rest of us, and that relates, I think, immediately to what you're doing.
I think that's a great explanation, and to tease it out for everyone, and as well as make sure I've got it right from you, having that worldview and that understanding of macro trends helps you as an investor see the green pastures that are ripe for investments and opportunities, the growth areas that are going to come about because you understand the way the world works. That doesn't necessarily help you pick the winners in there. Bitcoin early on was a great choice, but there are a lot of cryptocurrencies out there. And when you're going to pick which one of those to get involved with, it takes a deeper analysis and the experience you're talking about in really understanding what leads to some companies or some founders and leaders to be successful in that growing space and others not to. But it's much better to pick companies and do that diligence in a growing space than in a dying space, which is easy to overlook if you don't have the right worldview. Is that about right?
That's exactly right. And furthermore, I would just add that, and you touched on it, that I have found that to have, and this is probably going to sound trite, but nonetheless, to have super deep knowledge in a given sleeve is really helpful. So once I finally went down the rabbit hole, using Bitcoin as an example of what we're discussing with Bitcoin, I gained a really deep and rich understanding of the space, and then also went to conferences and so on, and began to know the players, and you really feel like you're at the forefront of the knowledge, frontier, and are gaining knowledge and insights that other people are lacking. Even in this case, people in the Bitcoin space. Bitcoin happens to have a big Twitter presence too, so you can get sort of real-time organic information from a space like that. Not all industries kind of benefit from that, although perhaps that's the future. But I would, harkening back to something you mentioned, I think really being not only deep in the space, but knowing the players and getting to know them personally is super helpful.
You know this about me, and most people who've listened to the podcast or know me in general know that I go to a lot of events as well, and think they're incredibly
Yeah.
invaluable to learn from other people, build those relationships. How do you get as much as you possibly can from those events? When you started going to those conferences, did you have any strategy, or were you literally just there to pick things up by osmosis, as you mentioned earlier, with your experience?
Yeah, in my case, I can see either way. It's sort of inductive versus deductive approach. But for me, it was more just gathering information, not really having an agenda. And then one finds that an agenda kind of develops, and you'll begin to discover that certain people know more about certain things. Again, just using Bitcoin as an example, but there might be people who know a lot about mining, or there might be some people who know some of the entrepreneurs who are working in other countries like El Salvador, and they would have greater insight into, say, like a sovereign issue at the country level, as in Argentina right now, or some of the challenges that miners face, or whatever might happen to be. Yes, I think for me anyway, it's been more organic, but I know you're a conference goer. I love them too, and it's not just in the investing space, in the freedom space as well. I think it can it inform your sort of macro view of the world, which can ultimately be helpful. I should add one more thing, which is just that, have you noticed that a lot of people overlook incentives? Like, I'm just like, okay, whenever I see, whether it's public policy or statements that are being made by an investor or a CEO, people kind of tend to take them at face value. And I guess as an economist, I'm always thinking about incentives, and so there's that Latin phrase, cui bono, like who benefits? So not to be constantly second guessing what I'm hearing, because I'd rather be a trusting individual, but I think it's really helpful and can inform your investing approach if you're thinking about, who's benefiting from what as you approach
Well, that's part of the Austrian worldview, right? That individual actors are the ones who drive everything in the economy, and every individual is motivated by incentives. That's a fundamental part of that worldview, isn't it?
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the investing side, but you mentioned you've been an entrepreneur as well, and oftentimes we learn the most from our failures rather than our successes. And so I want to go back to your entrepreneurial days, and when you mentioned you had a number of failures in there, as everyone who's an entrepreneur has. And I'm wondering if you're willing to share any of them or any of the big lessons you took away from that with everyone here.
Sure. So, I skipped over a couple of things earlier just for the sake of brevity, but, I think, I've been involved with at least 5 or 6 startups, and one was a pretty big success. The last one I mentioned, Harvest, was a really big success, but the other 3 or 4 were just abject failures. And so, one, for instance, was a consulting firm that I launched with a couple of other guys, consulting to nonprofits. I was kind of doing this on the side while I was working consulting. And it seemed like a really neat idea. And I think there is a need for that. But, you were in the space yourself. What I found is that, nonprofits don't have big checks to write. So no matter how good your idea is, dude, like step back and take a better look as to what the ultimate profitability of the space might be. No matter what the demand might be, are there profits to be had in the space? So that was one lesson I learned early on. And then, another is be careful the people with whom we're getting into bed. I was involved in another promising project in what was then called the 802.11b space, which is now called Wi-Fi. But back then it didn't have such a catchy term. And yeah, that was pretty ugly because it just felt like the people with whom I was working were not approaching the space as well as they might have, and I lacked the authority to really kind of help guide the ship. And so we really, I think, could have been a huge success, but without the right people in place, it just didn't pan out. And so, those are probably two takeaways. And on the people topic, I should mention maybe a couple more things. One is that I found that, there's always this question, is it what you know or who you know? And I think there's like a baseline level of knowledge that is really important to have in the world. Okay, so no matter what your industry, it's sort of expected that you're smart and you're sharp and you're hardworking and so forth. But I found beyond that, so long as you have that baseline level of intelligence and experience and willingness to work hard, it is kind of about who you know. And that speaks to what we were discussing earlier. It's really helpful to have a wide, diverse network. In fact, I even took a class in Chicago once, and we analyzed the quality of our own personal network. So we were told to kind of map out what our various nodes were. Hey, I had friends in the military, I had friends from school, and I had friends from work, and I had personal friends, and so on and so forth. And so we did this, and then, some people had really strong bonds with a few people, and then other people had weaker bonds with a whole array of people. So we do this, we hand in our networks to the professor, and then he announces to the class, I'm here to tell you that what you need to do is really, strong bonds are nice, but you will benefit most, empirically speaking, from broad networks. And that really kind of spoke to me. Happily, I had at the time a pretty broad network, but I think that would help you with that scanning of the horizon as an investor that I mentioned earlier. But it also helps when it comes to career opportunities, or if you're not hiring people.
Well, I think that's all absolutely right. And you're actually getting me to realize something, that I think it's when you're earlier in your career or you're not as advanced that you can have that dichotomy between what you know and who you know. You see them as two very separate worlds, basically. But as you progress, and as I think back in my career, I've noticed that who I know determines what I know, that they actually start to go hand in hand with each other and the dichotomy breaks down. And that's the value of going to conferences, of building your network, where you have those connections with people who help you understand the world in a different way, to understand what opportunities are out there that you wouldn't know about in any other way than by being in relationship with them and being able to do things with them then. So they start to work hand in hand.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a great point. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. So in any event, it sounds super trite to say, but in a knowledge economy, people are just like everything. When it comes to hiring, especially in a small firm, it's not just about, speaking of who versus what hiring people is not just science, it's art. So you could be looking at a whole range of resumes. And what I would often do is go to the bottom of the resume and look at the personal interest to get insight into the person, because a lot of these experiences blur together if you're looking at a bunch of capable people. And so that kind of boils down to the person and the fit. So it's as much sort of art as science. And I think it's super important to get the vibe right, because once you're investing that much of your time and energy and money into a given individual, to have them not be a good fit, not be a good team player, not understand the firm's mission, and so on and so forth. It's just an absolute disaster. And then you have to let them go. And then there's like, then you have to hire somebody else, or there's risk of a lawsuit. It's like a total nightmare, and it has to be documented properly. So getting the fit right up front is just so super crucial. And it's especially keen. It's something of which to be keenly aware as an entrepreneur.
100%. And I think that's such a valuable lesson that I think we can pretty much end there, except as you know from the podcast, there's one final question I like to ask everyone. And starts with the context that the best way to build a relationship, best way to learn something in my mind, getting to your point that about, or what we just talked about, that who you know determines what you know in the future. Best thing to do is to reach out to someone and offer to help them out, to give value to them in some way. And for anyone who's listening here and wants to learn more from you or connect with you, if they reached out and offered to do one thing for you, what would get you really excited that you would respond quickly and say, yeah, let's talk?
Yeah, well, I would love for somebody to wave a magic wand to give me more time, but lacking that, you're aware, Alexander, that I'm involved in several things, including Students for Liberty. I'm an advisor there, also with the Atlas Network. One of the things that has me most jazzed right now is called the Global Liberty Institute, and it was founded by a guy named Scott Atlas, who was a real hero during the pandemic lockdowns. And now he's grown concerned about sort of our infringements on civil liberties, and he's establishing an organization that is sort of companion, a mirror image of the World Economic Forum. And we're actively recruiting younger people to get involved with this and to be in. We're going to actively help them to get positions within the private sector, NGOs, the public sector, now that we've had some success ourselves. And so please, I would invite people to reach out in that regard in particular, also look into the Global Liberty Institute itself, perhaps consider a donation. But, I'm here to, pass the baton and help others succeed where I have as well. So, I would love some help, but I'm happy to be of help to others as well.
I think that is a fantastic invitation to everyone here to get involved in the Global Liberty Institute, whether as a young person to get help from this or as a participant or a donor. I would strongly encourage that to everyone too.
This is maybe, I was wondering whether or not to even mention this, but, there's that age-old question as to whether or not you work to live or live to work. And I think actually for me anyway, and this could just be Alexander and David talking, but it's like, I think I've concluded that I work to live. It's not necessarily about, this could be a controversial position, but, it is work. You don't have to love what you do. I mean, there are going to be things that are going to be kind of, a grind. But that should not be discouraging. That should not be a signal that you're in the wrong place. Sometimes life is just a grind. You've got to punch through it. And if you believe in the mission, it's okay. Like I used to, when I was younger, view that as a signal that maybe I was in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing. And then furthermore, if you're working to live, that gives you time to do the things that you and I do, which is to be involved in the freedom movement. I'm involved in their local church. And so it's just, the way my life panned out was beneficial in retrospect, but it was kind of almost by accident it panned out this way, or maybe it was God's hand guiding it. But nonetheless, frankly, I did well, and now I can give back. And if I had devoted myself and stayed to say a nonprofit, I'm not sure I'd be in this position to be of as much help, even though that might have been kind of a mission-driven calling.
I think the last point you made there is really important. And one of the big reasons why I'm doing Liberty Ventures now, I came from the nonprofit space. That's how I first thought I would make an impact in the world. Actually, before that, I thought I'd become a philosophy professor, and thankfully realized that was not the way to change the world. And came to realize there's so much more you can do by going into business to make the world a better place, a freer place. Even if it's not the business itself that's doing that, that's making the world freer, by empowering other people, by generating more wealth, being able to donate it, being able to use the bully pulpit to amplify your message. That's so powerful. And we need more people to go into business to make the world better, instead of thinking the idealistic thing to do is to go into nonprofit or academia or something else. Those are good, but that's not the only way to make the world better. And And so for me, I love that you're focused on living. I think that should be the focus for everyone. But maybe this is my millennial perspective on things. I don't like to see a separation between work and life, or at least no more so than anything else that I do to just take care of myself. Is brushing my teeth really living? No, I find it pretty boring, but it's something I better do every day, and still in service of my higher purpose of what I'm trying to do and taking care of myself. And there shouldn't be that much of a discrepancy between my work passion and my life passions in my mind. And if there is a discrepancy, I work to change that as quickly as possible.
Yeah, no, that's it is easier now to do that too, right? Because we can work from home and there's this kind of, so I get that. And I think that that is an excellent point. And by the way, when it comes to brushing your teeth, you may be familiar with the old phrase, um, whatever thy hand findeth to do it with thy might. And that's exactly right, right? It's just like, whether you're brushing your teeth or slaving away at the desk, trying to reconcile a spreadsheet or something, it's, just do it to the best of your ability and you'll get greater satisfaction out of it anyway. Um, so I think you raise a good point. But, I think we're in agreement that, and it took me a while to figure this out, but I think actually being in the arena, like being a capitalist in the private sector is apt to have the greatest impact. And after all, I claim to be a capitalist. I mean, I ought to kind of, put my money where my mouth is anyway, right? Literally and figuratively.
Exactly.
I think a lot when it comes to preparation. I mean, when it comes to being an entrepreneur, a lot of it's about preparation, and it kind of relates to even to your like teeth brushing example. It's like, Abe Lincoln said something like, if I had 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend 4 hours sharpening my axe. And I find that's kind of the approach I take to pretty much every realm of my life. Like I found that if you just prepare very carefully for what you're doing, and that it just saves so much agony down the road. And then also have like a plan, not just B, but a plan C, D, E, and F. So that, if one road is blocked, you can immediately kind of revert to your alternative plan. That probably relates to my military training as well. It's like that old phrase that the royal family had, like air and a spare, right? It's like, you want to have the guy in line to become king, but you also want to have like a plan B in case something goes amiss, as it did with George the Sixth, I guess he was, and or Edward the Eighth, and then George the Sixth. But again, I think that applies to many realms of life, and for an entrepreneur in particular to really evaluate, I'm reminded of that earlier startup that I did that was such a failure. To really evaluate your market and your customer base and be brutally honest with yourself and others about what your prospects actually are is just crucially important, because otherwise you're going to delude yourself. You want to be a dreamer, you're an entrepreneur, but you're going to delude yourself into thinking that the opportunity is greater than it really is. And it's important just to be brutally honest with yourself, with your potential investors, with your employees, and everyone else.
So I think that's all absolutely right, but want to put a finer point on it for entrepreneurs listening or people who want to be entrepreneurs, because it's not just about planning things out and having backup options. It is very much also about going out and testing things out, which is what the best entrepreneurs do. They get real world feedback on their plans and ideas. So it's not just armchair philosophizing, it's figuring out, okay, this actually works and we can do more of it, or that was a terrible idea. Let's go to plan B, let's go to plan C, and have those available once you encounter the real world.
That's exactly right. In fact, you put it better than I did, really, because I think what I was saying is really like before you go to market. But then once you're in the battle, if you want to think of it that way, then it's time to, with a few sort of backup plans in mind, start improvising and adapting to the situation. That's where fear of failure becomes like a big problem, right? Because if you're a perfectionist like I am, you're afraid sometimes to like just start, boxing away in the arena, because you're afraid you're going to screw up. But I've learned, and you just spoke to this, that failure is crucial. Like you have to start failing so you can get that failure under your belt and start learning, right?
100%. We even talked about that at the start of this. Every entrepreneur has a series of failures, and there's just part of it to be successful.
Exactly. And I think, well, Churchill mentioned this, although I don't think he was the first to say it, but faint heart never won fair lady, right? I mean, you just have to like, yeah, you need to prepare. And I honestly believe in what I just said, but by the same token, to your point, like you just have to go for it and then start adapting to your environment.
Yep. And to offer another Churchill quote for when you do encounter those failures or hardships, if you're going through hell, keep going. That's what it takes.
Never, ever, 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 ever give up or something like that.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, I know. It's so true. Um, well, the other thing on that score that I should mention is that, I think it was Coolidge, one of my favorite presidents, and perhaps yours too, but he's certainly an unsung
Mhm.
president. Said if you see, it's something along these lines, like if you see 9 problems coming down the road, or 10 problems coming down the road, 9 of them will fall in the ditch. And it's true. Like, you're not going to anticipate every single problem. And furthermore, many of them may never come to pass. So don't worry about it. Like, just start, playing the game and doing the best you can. And as you just mentioned, we were discussing, adapt as best you can to the market environment or the latest development or this challenge or that problem or whatever it might happen to be. And try and make an omelet out of the broken eggs.
That's right. And I hadn't heard that quote from Coolidge, although it reminds me a lot of Stoicism, frankly. And a famous quote that I forget if it's from Marcus Aurelius or Seneca it's one of the Stoics, basically saying that I've encountered many calamities in my life, almost all of which were all in my head or my imagination. And that is where most of our failures and our traumas really do come from. It's not the real world, it's stuff that we build up ourselves instead of actually experiencing.
So true. And, by the way, as an aside, I think we just lived that the last few years. I mean, a lot of people were conjuring up dangers and calamities that never did come to pass. And, our solution to these problems was sometimes worse than the problem itself. So it's really important to kind of keep things in perspective. And again, entrepreneurs need to keep a ruthless eye on risk. Like, how objectively risky is this move going to be? And I think we're apt to both over and underestimate risk in all aspects of our lives. And but when there's money on the line, especially when it's somebody else's money, is that much more important to be super objective.
Is there any advice that you would have for entrepreneurs or investors in evaluating that risk and maintaining that objectivity instead of getting caught up in the whirlwind of opportunity and dreams and of fancy that comes with having dollar signs in your eyes sometimes?
Yeah, well, I'll acknowledge that's hard, right? Because to be a successful entrepreneur, you have to be a dreamer. Because if you understand all the problems are going to come your way before you launch the business, you'll never do it because it's too intimidating. So it's difficult. You have to be sort of the dreamer and yet also objective. And if you have the funding to do it, this is sort of the classic design, but I think it works. You see this in the military as well. You need to have sort of the visionary leader. But you also need to have a partner or a second in command who can be the detail guy. And he typically has a more kind of ruthless mindset and, keeps the trains running on time and so forth. Now, if you're a solo practitioner, you probably have to kind of keep both those worldviews in mind, which is hard. And most of us aren't wired that way. But I think the formula that tends to work is to have the yin and the yang embedded within the organization and do your best to kind of get along because sometimes you're very different. But I think that formula kind of works. We need to lock arms instead of locking horns, right? And
Yes.
And now more than ever, I feel like all of us within this community, whether it's social conservatives or libertarians or atheists or Christians or whatever it might happen to be, like, this is our moment. So let's get to know each other and start rowing in the same direction.
just want to say thank you for sharing all of this with us, David, and for everything that you're doing to advance a freer and more prosperous world.
No, thank you, Alexander. I salute you and everything you're doing. So thanks again.